The following is an excerpt from the Pro Wrestling Exuberant email newsletter June 7th, 2024 edition. To subscribe for free and get original wrestling articles on topics from the past and present, news analysis on all the latest happenings in the world of professional wrestling, and reviews of wrestling figures and other assorted merchandise, go to substack.com/at the Pro Wrestling Exuberant. Hulkamania is real. I first started watching pro wrestling in September of 1985, and I started watching it all because of a cartoon. At the time, pro wrestling's popularity was growing fast. The first WrestleMania had just occurred in March at Madison Square Garden in front of approximately 19,000 people. Over 1 million people viewed the event through closed-circuit television in arenas and movie theaters across the country. The event included popular TV actor Mr. T in the main event, teaming with Hulk Hogan against Rowdy Roddy Piper and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. Celebrity guest involvement of Cyndi Lauper, Muhammad Ali, and Liberace helped attract additional mainstream attention. In September 1985, Hulk Hogan, who had become WWF champion in January 1984 by defeating the Iron Sheik, was immensely popular and had rapidly growing mainstream recognition. He had been on the cover of Sports Illustrated the prior April, and WWF itself, with Hogan as the centerpiece, was bringing in lots of new fans as they ran live shows across the country, packing arenas, and marketed the WWF and its superstars heavily into mainstream consciousness of the time. The multi-decade-long era of pro wrestling promotions as regional territories was heading towards a rapid end in 1985. WWF was in the midst of its aggressive expansion into a national promotion and international product, with both syndicated and cable TV programming that coincided with regional promotions losing its top talent to WWF as the promotion began running shows in the same area the regional promotions were based out of and airing program locally in competition as well. The regional promotions saw business fall off and were seemingly going out of business and disappearing in rapid succession. WWF's competitors in the national scene were the NWA, based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, airing in syndication and on cable, and run by Jim Crockett Jr., and mostly running shows in the southern U.S. with an eye to expanding further north in the eastern U.S. and spreading out all over the country. The other competition was the AWA, based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, run by Vern Gagne and holding shows primarily in the Midwest. AWA aired on ESPN 5 days a week. To combat the WWF's rapid expansion, the AWA formed an alliance a year prior with the NWA and several of the surviving regional promotions to run star-studded shows, including drawing approximately 21,000 people to Comiskey Park in Chicago on September 28, 1985 for Super Clash featuring Ric Flair vs. Magnum TA for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship and Rick Martel vs. Stan Hansen for the AWA World Heavyweight Champion. The alliance was called Pro Wrestling USA, and it did not last long. This was the scene of professional wrestling in the fall of 1985. One Saturday morning in September 1985, I put on the TV and a show called Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling was on as part of a Saturday morning cartoon lineup. Saturday morning cartoon blocks were popular in the early 80s in the days prior to widespread cable access. The show featured animated versions of Hulk Hogan, the Iron Sheik, Nikolai Volkov, Roddy Piper, Andre the Giant, and several other top stars of the time. The wrestlers did not do their own voices for the cartoon, and the storylines on the show did not have to do with wrestling itself either. But the show nevertheless captured my attention enough to make me curious about professional wrestling. After a few weeks of watching the cartoon, I wondered what actual professional wrestling was like. At the time, a program called WWF Superstars of Wrestling aired late Saturday morning on local television. It was a syndicated program, meaning the show aired in local television markets across the country. The matches consisted of a named star against a quote-unquote jobber. A jobber is a dated term referencing a wrestler who appeared on TV every week and never won, often getting in very little offense in quick matches. Some of these wrestlers also worked the opening matches against each other on the WWF house show circuit, which was a live event, non-televised show that ran nearly every night of the week year-round as WWF toured all over the country. The first thing I saw when I turned on WWF Superstars for the first time in the fall of 1985 was Don Morocco, with his manager Mr. Fuji at his side, hanging Ricky the Dragon Steamboat by his own karate belt over the top rope, making Steamboat dangle around and clutch at the belt to free himself. I was immediately drawn into the action and started watching the show every week, becoming increasingly familiar with all the stars and different feuds taking place, pitting the good guys, who abided by the rules, against the bad guys who did not abide by the rules, and often had colorful, loudmouth managers at their side to help them cheat during matches. Like many new fans during that period, I was drawn to Hulk Hogan, and he quickly became my favorite. Action movies were wildly popular in this era as movie theater releases, and Hulk Hogan, with his blonde hair, huge muscles, deep tan, wild-eyed enthusiasm, and charismatic speaking ability, stood out and looked like an action movie star who had crossed over to wrestling to vanquish all the villains in the world of wrestling. As I believe history shows, Hulk Hogan was the right person at the right time to take pro wrestling to new heights of popularity in the 1980s and set things in motion for pro wrestling to become even more popular over the decades to follow the height of his wrestling fame. He's still one of my all-time favorite wrestlers nearly 40 years later from the first time I saw him on television. Over the next few months, I began to watch other WWF shows like the syndicated Wrestling Challenge, which aired on Saturday afternoon on local television, and Primetime Wrestling, which aired on Monday night on cable. Primetime's format involved Bobby the Brain Heenan and Gorilla Monsoon in the studio introducing different matches, taped at some of the more well-known arenas for wrestling at the time, like Boston Garden, Philadelphia Spectrum, and Madison Square Garden. I learned a lot of cliches from Monsoon, like, you could cut the electricity in here with a knife, whenever there was a particular exciting match. They're hanging from the rafters, for a sold-out show, and close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, whenever it was very close to a 3 count on a cover. In between the matches on the syndicated shows, there would be interviews inserted for each local TV market with an announcer, usually Mean Gene Okerlund, and a wrestler hyping their match at the upcoming show at the local arena later that month. During one of these interviews, Randy Macho Man Savage informed the viewing audience, with Miss Elizabeth at his side, he would be challenging and defeating Hulk Hogan for the WWF Championship in December at my local arena in the main event. I wanted to see WWF live, and this would be my first show. It was sold out that night, and I only remember 2 things about the actual wrestling matches. I remember the opening match clearly, which featured SD Special Delivery Jones defeating Iron Mike Sharp. The other thing I remember is a high volume of cheers for Hulk Hogan as he did his post-match celebration after defeating Savage in the main event. Hulk strutted to each side of the ring, winding his right hand up in dramatically slow fashion before cupping the hand against the outside of his ear, his call for the crowd on that side of the ring to cheer louder if they wanted his signature most muscular pose aimed in their direction. The crowd gave Hulk a roar in return. Then he nodded his head in approval and flexed his tan muscles in assorted poses. While this was going on, fans were throwing their rubber LJN Hulk Hogan figures into the ring in startling increasing numbers in a wild celebration that was all part of the phenomena known as Hulkamania that was sweeping the country, and a nightly routine for Hulk Hogan at sold-out arenas across the country. I remember being quite surprised that fans were giving away their Hulk Hogan figures by throwing them into the ring that night. But that was the passionate fandom that Hulk inspired among people. I still, by the way, have my own Hulk Hogan figure. The very first wrestling figure I ever bought was the LJN Hulk Hogan figure. It's sitting on a shelf just a few steps away as I write this. As is my Hulk Hogan yellow foam giant finger I purchased that night. The giant index finger points up to symbolize Hulk is number 1, with the words Hulk Hogan, WWF World Heavyweight Champion, emblazed across the center of the hand in red. At the time, a large number of wrestling magazines were available each month at the newsstand, and I used to purchase all of them on a monthly basis and read them in its entirety. It was through these magazines that I learned there were other wrestling promotions besides the WWF. I sought out all the ones that were available on TV in my area and began watching them as 1985 came to a close. To be continued. Subscribe for free to the Pro Wrestling Exuberant email newsletter at substack.com/@the Pro Wrestling Exuberant. Also, you can listen to new episodes of the Pro Wrestling Exuberant podcast on a weekly basis.